Hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar on React.js. We'll be live, or we'll be starting in 2 short minutes. We'll be starting in 2 short minutes, folks. All right, folks, welcome to this series of webinars once again by Be My App. My name is Fernando, and it's a pleasure having all of you here. In this webinar, we're going to be speaking by React.js, and we have Pascal Weiland, who he's a developer from Germany. He's here to speak about it. So this is an intro. So this is perfect for all of you who have been curious on how to start React. This is the day. And with that, basically, as always, if you have any more questions or if you want to find out more events or future webinars, you can always visit us at bmap.com and you can just click on the join community. You can get updates on our next webinars and our next webinars and hackathons and so much. And without further delay, I'm introduced to the man of the hour, Cal, if you would so.
Hello. Thank you for joining this webinar. I'm very excited to do that. It's actually kind of the first time I'm doing a webinar in this form. So I will just start with introducing myself. My name is Pascal Weiland. I'm a web developer currently working in Berlin at a company called BitCrowd, and we are doing like Elixir, Rails, and JavaScript. And I mainly work with React at the moment. Before I did work with Backbone.js, jQuery, but recently I just had the chance to only work with React. I was starting with web development when I was 11 years old, so I'm doing this for over 10 years now, and it's still exciting for me. With React, I started at Christmas 2013, as it's always when there are Christmas holidays where you have lots of time. And I randomly on GitHub jumped over React, and I was playing around with it. And since then, I was always having smaller side projects with React. But at that time, I was mainly working with Angular. But starting in 2014, I was managing to work more and more with React. And also I like emojis and cookies. I think I eat a lot of cookies in order to produce good software. I will give you a short overview about this webinar. My aim is to give you a short, like an overview and a basic introduction to React. I don't want to convince you to use React instead of anything else. It's just, I want to show you the basics and I want to show you why and how I like it. And that's it so far. I will start with some basics. I will also mention some ES 2015 basics in case you're not familiar with them. Then I will talk a bit about the virtual DOM, JSX, the React components, a bit about Flux and Redux, Webpack, and I also will do live coding to show you how to start with React. When I start, here are some charts about React. They're basically from Google Trends. On the left-hand side, you just see the interest. You see in the end of 2013, the peak is very low, or the graph is very low, and there's this peak in 2015, which was really the year where React, or the popularity of your React, was exploding. The second diagram shows the interest in Angular, React, Backbone, and Ember.js. We really see currently like Angular is really leading, but you also see that there's also this high peak of React recently. Backbone and Ember.js are really pretty low compared to the others. So what is React? The website from Facebook described it as JavaScript library for building user interfaces. They even have this in caps lock. And it's also to refer to the V in MVC. Like MVC is model view controller, which is a very famous pattern used in many other libraries or Ruby on Rails. Then it has the virtual DOM, which is an abstraction to the real browser DOM. And they build it, the browser DOM is slowly, or updates in the browser DOM are slowly. So they have this virtual DOM with lots of diffing algorithms in order to make clever updates. Then it has a one-way reactive data flow, which means the data only goes into one direction, like a stream. And it's not like, for example, Angular, where you have a two-way data binding. React doesn't have this, and this makes React a lot kind of easier and faster. Also, React was first introduced on May 2013 at JSConf US. And currently there are about 6,722 commits and more than 689 contributors, which is really amazing. And the its current version is 15 or 15.0.2, which was released on the 30th of April. Then I want to focus that React is a library, which means, for example, Backbone or especially Angular is a framework. And the difference between a framework and a library is that a library has a fixed API, and that's it. And a framework, for example, does way more things, or can do often way more things than a normal library does. And this is actually the biggest advantage of React, that it says, okay, we do have a fixed size of APIs you can use, but also, as they say, they are just the view layer in MVC. It means that React doesn't really care about how you handle data, where the data comes from, and how the data goes back to the backend. But React is only the view, so it cares about showing the view and doing stuff in the view. But all the other things are not a concern of React. And this is also why one can use React with other frameworks. For example, there are people using React with Backbone or even with Angular. It's really simple. And you can also actually put React into everything that you have. Like if you have an own framework, you can just say, okay, I want to use the React for my view layer. But also, it's important to mention that React is not really a template thing. It's more than templates. And React does actually have 3 or 4 main APIs. The first is just the React API, which are all the methods attached to the React object. Then there is the React Component API. Then there's the React.dom API, which is just a factory for JSX, but this is something we'll show later. And there's React DOM, which is actually an own package. And React DOM is there to interact with the real DOM, because all the other things are virtual DOM. I will show you this later. Okay, let's start. This is a React ES5 API. And we see we have a variable called hello, and then we have react.createClass. And in the constructor of createClass, we pass an object that has one attribute, and this is a function called render. And this function returns a React element, which is created by react.createElement, which is a div. The second parameter is null, and the third is hello. And the props name, what this is basically doing, it's just returning a div with hello in it. This is the same code, and below there's the React DOM render, which is taking the component that we created, and it's rendering this component into the container with the ID app. This is now a different syntax. If I switch back, here we see React.createElement. And here we have a div. And this is often confusing. This is also which confused many people in the beginning. This syntax is called JSX. And this looks really like there were people putting HTML into JavaScript, which actually, if you see this, it's true, but actually it's not true, because this gets transpiled that it's look like React.createElement. And this is a kind of shorthand notation, so you can easily build your interfaces. Because XML or HTML is familiar to you, you will also easily see, okay, what kind of element is this? And if we focus below on the render method, there we do the same thing. We switch from React.createElement to just hello. And this is doing the same thing as creating an element from hello. And instead of passing the object with name hello, we just have this attribute name. And this is also like it is working in both cases. Also now we go to ES 2015, because here we just have our normal variable. And here we use the class notation. And this is kind of important because since React 0.14, the class notation was introduced, so one can define components as classes. There are people in JavaScript world who don't like classes because JavaScript doesn't really have classes. Because of that, there are people saying classes are evil. But in general, this is a kind of clean notation for React components. And in the end, it's actually resulting into the same result. So under the hood, it's just React.createClass anyways. This is a different notation we will also see later. This is just a pure function. And we use the arrow function, but I will explain you what arrow functions are later. Yeah, let's start with ES 2015, that was also formerly known as ES6, but as far as I know, they officially said, okay, this is ES 2015, and this year is ES 2016, which is the current JavaScript standard. All the links are clickable, and I will see to publish the slides so you can just visit the links later. The first link is a nice overview of all the equivalents of ES6 and ES5. And recently there was a tweet by WebKit that they said WebKit now is 100% ES6 compatible, which means every WebKit engine, when they implement it, they have all the ES6 features. Below that, there is this compatible, which is amazing, where you can see which features are implemented from ES6. And if you want to play around with that, I can recommend Babel.js IO /REPL, which is something I use a lot, and you can just play with all your JavaScript things. And also Babel is the transpiler which transpiles ES 2015 code to ES5 code, which will run in all browsers. And it's really helpful to see, okay, how does this result? Does this even work? I can really recommend it. Also, you can use the Scratch.js browser extension, which does the same. I think they also have support for CoffeeScript and TypeScript. Another important note is you can use ES 2015 in JSBin or JSFiddle. And if you have a modern browser, which I think, you can also play with many features in your console from the browser. Let's start with let and consts. On the left-hand side, we have var name is equal to cake. On the right-hand side, we use let name is equal to cake, which is just a small change. But in general, in ES 2015, it's a good practice to use const for most of the things. But when your variable is changing at a certain time, then it makes sense to use let instead of const. The second example is a limit, which is a constant, where we definitely say, okay, this is a constant. The third example is a for loop. And instead of using var, we use let. And this has a very huge advantage, because if we use let, the variable I is block scoped. This means it only lives in the block of the for loop that doesn't exist afterwards, which is an advantage, because so we don't pollute any global scope. Last example is just how to use the common JS modules, for example, in Node. The most recent Node version, they support constants as well. So you could just write const React is equal to React instead of var statement. Just as conclusion, don't use var, use const or let instead. And then there are also modules. These modules are not yet in a browser or in any or a Node directly. You always need a module loader, but there are plenty out there. And this is just the syntax which changes. It looks maybe a bit like Python or something like that, but in my opinion, it's superior and easier syntax to use. The first example just imports the default, which is normally exported by export default or module exports. The second one shows if multiple values, I can just use this notation to say, yeah, give me the prop types from React. And the third example on the right side shows, okay, I can import the default, which is React, but I can also import the prop types from the React package. Yeah. Then there are classes. As I said, these are no native or real classes. This is just a class notation, which gets basically transpiled to the thing that we see on the right side. Because JavaScript doesn't have classes. They still have the prototype inheritance. And this is just a nice notation maybe for people who come from the Java world. There's not really much changing. The most important thing is we have a constructor, and instead of writing function hello, we just write hello in classes. Then there are the arrow functions, which are basically, they just save you a bit of typing. They also have a second very important advantage, which is they don't have an own scope, because usually every function does have an own scope, which means if I want to use this, I cannot access the parent this, so that I have to put the parent this into an own variable, which often is a bit annoying. And here's just an example how I normally use map. And the second example shows, okay, how to use it with an arrow function. And the third example looks a bit weird, but this is what I want to say with the scope of an arrow function. We just map this name in the console, and usually this wouldn't work in a normal function because there is no property name on the function. But since arrow functions inherit the parent scope, we can just access it. This is also something we'll use a lot in React because it makes things easier. Then there is the destructuring objects. It's pretty helpful. We have a normal object with first name and last name. And I can just say const first name, last name is equal to object. And they will destruct these two properties from the object, which means it creates two variables. And I can use them. Then I can also destruct arrays with the same method. Maybe some people using Elixir, it looks a bit familiar to that. And how to really use it shows the second example where I just use the match with a regular expression. And usually the first expression contains everything. And in this case, I want to look for the word which comes after hello. And I can just easily obtain it by using this notation. And then there are default params, which is just, maybe people coming from the Java world already know this. Then there are the REST params, which is also helpful. In this case, I can just say, yeah, this is the first parameter, I want to work with that, and all the other are REST parameters. So I don't really care how many parameters are there. I just collect all of them in the args array. And then there's the spread operator, which basically takes an array and spreads it. So if you're familiar with the math.max API, I just pass the array, but this API takes comma separated every value. And the spread operator is just spreading the array. And in the end, the 42 is the highest value. Also, I can concat arrays with it, which is pretty helpful. I have this array num with 3, 4, and 5. And I have a second array or with 1, 2, and then the spread operator with none. And afterwards, there's another further element. And in the end, it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the last case is in React or JSX. There's also a thing where we have properties, which is in this case are hello and level. And when I pass properties to a component, I can also use, in this case, the spread operator. It will just take all these properties and apply it to this component. Here's just an example how we use the previous one together in React. In this case, we say we take out the name, and then we use just the rest params. And we apply this to the hello world component, where we say, okay, we only want to give the rest props. So this will receive all the other props except name. Another really important feature of ES 2015 are template literals, which basically have two huge advantages. One thing is kind of this interpolation. We just say $, where you can insert a variable or basically expressions that you can't really put in statements, but you can use like the ternary operator, things like that. And you can also even pass a function to that. And the second most important features are multi-line strings, because in JavaScript you can't really do multi-line strings. You always have to kind of concat them because this break is not really supported. And this is something which perfectly works in with template literals. So basically one can say if you use strings which are more complex, you can always use, or should always use template literals. Then just some terms in general, like there's a string, which is a normal string, then an object, which is an object, and a DOM node, which is something like document get element by ID or document query selector. And some React terms. React basically has some kind of types. There's the React element, which consists of a type, properties, a key, and a reference. The most important thing are type and props. And you create an element by react.createElement. And an element is basically, can be everything that we create, but I will show the API of this later. And then there's a React node, which can be a React element, string, or a number of arrays of React nodes. A React node is often used when we pass children to a React component. Then there's the React component, which has all the component lifecycle methods. Then let's start with a virtual DOM. Virtual DOM is basically the React.createElement, which is the React equivalent to document create element, which is just the that virtual DOM. And there are a lot of shortcuts which can be found at react.dom.div or react.dom.ul. All these things are also internally used in JSX, but one can use them if one wants to, but you can always use react.createElement. Then the React API, there is react.createClass, which is the basic method to create a React component. And I just pass an object with all the settings, all the attributes I want to have. In this case, there's then the render method in or get initial state and all these things. Then there's React.createElement. It just creates a React element, and it takes either a string or a React class. And normally a string is lowercase because it's a div, a UL, button, span, whatever. Or a React class. A React class is something to create above, or a React component, which is the same. The next thing is React component. This is the basic component which we extend when we use the class notation, but it's the same as in the first example with React.createClass. Then there's React.dom. This was the virtual DOM factory thing. And in the end, there are React.prop types, where they contain a lot of prop types which we can apply to our component. And then there's also the React DOM.api, which is not too important. This is just how React interacts with the real world, or the real DOM. And it just takes a React element. And a second argument, it takes a DOM element. And optionally, there's also a callback. With the React element, something usually we pass our component there. But we can't just pass it, we have to create an element out of the component. But this is possible because the React create element also accepts the React class. Then there is React DOM unmount component node. We can just unmount it. We can also find the DOM node. And then there is React DOM server, which has two methods, render to string and render to static markup. They are almost the same, except that render to string can be used for server-side rendering. So you can create universal or isomorphic apps. You just have a node server which does that. And if you use render to string, you can, React can, in the browser, find out that it's already rendered that. We'll just attach some event listeners, and then you can have perfectly server rendering. The second method, render to static markup, also renders the React component as HTML, but it doesn't attach any React things to it. So it's basically static markup you can use if you want to use this as a template thing, but it's just outputting markup, no React code. Then there's the component API, which is pretty simple. Every component has a constructor, which we don't even have to use because it's in there automatically. And it has in this state and this props. And this is basically, like, these are the only two things that comes with a component. When we extend a component, we have to, we receive the props, and we have to make sure that we pass the props to this props. And we can also define a state, which is the state, and we can say what the state should be. When there are any updates we want to do to this component, there is set state, define a new state. Also, there's the method force update, which is something we usually don't use. We only use it if we know there were changes. For example, if there is a very huge state and there is a change of the very least element very down on the tree, then the React will maybe not know about it because it doesn't really do this deep equal thing, which means if we know we changed something, we can call force update and it will force the update. Also, when there were changes happening from the outside world, which is possible, we can also then say, okay, we call force update to make sure that the component is up to date. And then the component API is when we create a component with class notation or with React.createClass. The most important thing is the render method. The render method always returns a virtual DOM. This always returns like our markup and everything that we want to have in the components. Then there's get initial state, which is something we don't have when we use the class notation, because there we define the state in the constructor. It's the same with get default props. These two methods are only used when we use React.create class. Then there are prop types, where we can define types for our properties. This basically is for development to make sure that we pass the right types. Then there are mixins, which are also only available in React.create class. And statics, the same. And the display name, where we can define the name of the component, but JSX will do this automatically for us. Next thing are the component API methods. And as I said, has this render function or the render method, which is really essential. But there are more kind of lifecycle methods. For example, component will mount will be called before the component mounts. Then component did mount will be invoked after the component did mount. And in this method, we can attach some event listeners and all these things because they know, okay, this is mounted and it will stay like that. Then there is component will receive props. This will be invoked when there are new props applied to the component, and we can just make sure to what will happen with these components, with these properties. Then there is should component update, which is something where we can define by ourselves how and when a component should be updated. We will see the next state and the next props, and we can just do our own calculations just to make sure whether component should update. And we can say, okay, there are different things, but this is not necessary for my component to update it. Then there's component will update, which is something which is called shortly before the component is updated, where we have the next props and the next state. We can just make sure to work with that. And then there is component did update. This will be invoked after every update, where we also have the previous props and the previous state to do some calculations or maybe to fire some events. And the last one is component will unmount, and this will be called shortly before the component is unmounted. Usually when we attach event listeners or stuff like that in component did mount, we have to destroy these in component will unmount. One thing about React are stateless components, because usually when we build apps, we have state. And in React, we have the advantage to build stateless components, which means this component does not have any state. We just pass properties, in this case, the age property, and we display this. But we can also now have this notation. We had this before. And now, as you know, this is an arrow function, and this is just a function taking a props parameter and returning a React element showing the props. Then let's jump to JSX. JSX is an embeddable XML in JavaScript, and tags are basically transformed to function invocations. Every JSX tag must be closed. So either we use, as in the next example, a div with a slash, or we have to close it manually. Then when we write lowercase, this means it's an HTML element like a div. If we use uppercase, we basically mostly refer to an existing React component. And there's also a thing, when we use JSX, it doesn't require React. We can also use JSX for own things or with any different adapters, but it's not necessary for using React. And also using React doesn't require to use JSX, so it's optional as well. This is a bit how JSX looks like. On the left-hand side, we have a div. On the right-hand side, we say, okay, just React create element div. The same with a component. Component is written uppercase, with the first letter is uppercase. And this is basically creating an element of the component. example shows our element with a class, and we can't use class like we use it in HTML because, as you know, it's transpiled to JavaScript, and a JavaScript class is a reserved word, so we're not able to use it, and this is why we have to use class name. And on the right-hand side, you see now there's a second parameter, which is just an object with a class name. And the last example shows like all three parameters. Like we have an attribute, and also we pass a child to the element. And on the right-hand side, we see, okay, it's a div with the class object, and the third parameter is just a string with hello. And the string could also be a further React element or a component. This is basically like HTML works. Then let's talk about binding. And usually when I work with normal HTML, I maybe use onClick or onFocus or things like that. This doesn't really work with JSX. In JSX, we just have the camel case on event names. And in React, it's like they basically use some event delegation, but we'll show this later. Concerning binding, we have some problems, which are not real problems, but in the onClick, we just say this dot handle click. And handle click is a method from the class. Usually, I would assume, okay, this works, but unfortunately, there's a problem that in the handle click, we have this set state, and also we refer to this state clicked. And render is an own function. So in render, we can't access this state and this set state. This is why we have to add .bind this in order to make this working. But this is just one example, because this maybe doesn't look that nice. We have also an option that we say, okay, in the constructor of this component, we say this .handle click is equal to this .handle click bind this, so we don't have to do this in the render method. Or if we go back to the example, we can also say, okay, we just add an arrow function, which in this case, just takes the event parameter and passes it to the handle click. These are the two options we have when we want to have a proper binding. Yeah, then events, for example, when you work with jQuery or other things before, you maybe use an add event listener or the jQuery on method, or maybe on click, on load, end click, whatever. This doesn't really exist in React. Theoretically, you could use it, except end click maybe. But React does have own methods for that. And it's actually pretty simple. You can attach on every element and on click, or on inputs and on focus, on change, written in camel case. And React uses event delegation in order to figure out where which event happened, and to do performance events and or performance event handling. If you want to learn more, there's a nice article about event delegation. And this is how React is then handling the events for us. Another important thing with React is CSS. There are some options, like we have the normal style attribute in React, which receives a normal object with the style definitions. Then there is a nice package called class names, which is a bit like classes in Angular, where you can really work when you have multiple classes with certain conditions. It's really great. Then there are the concept of CSS modules, where you somehow import existing CSS to apply it to your component. And also React has a nice support for animation itself. Then there's the thing, inline styles and or CSS modules. There's for inline styles a nice package called Aphrodite, which is a nice one if you want to work with inline styles. Then there's CSSX, which is a nice way of using CSS and JavaScript. And there's the official CSS modules thing, and modular scoped CSS, the CS.js. And there's also a person who did an overview of using CSS and JavaScript, which is for JavaScript, but also a strong focus on React, which I can really recommend if you want to know how to use CSS and JavaScript, because there are really many, many ways. You can also just use your standard CSS, which you include, and that's also fine. Another really important thing is the architecture, because React has like the advantage, which is also a kind of problem, that it's just the view layer. So there is no real architecture. You can build your components, you can really build nice reusable components, but you do not really have any architecture. And this is where Flux comes in. Flux is a pattern which comes from Facebook mainly, and it's, for example, a Facebook package actually just has a dispatcher. Flux has the idea: you have a dispatcher, you have stores and views. It has a unidirectional data flow, which means the data only goes in one direction, doesn't go back. It works that there's a user action in a view. This creates an action on the dispatcher. The store, which holds the business logic and application states, will be changed, and then it updates the view, which is the basic idea of Flux. But I will personally maybe use Redux. There are many Flux implementations, like the Facebook Flux thing, alt.js, multi.js Fluxor, which is something which I can recommend. But there's also this table where there is a huge comparison of many Flux implementations. And I would personally stick with Redux, which is something I think most people who work with React, they will know about it. And Redux, basically, they took the ideas from the Flux pattern, also from Elm. It's really pretty small, and they have this three main concepts, which is single source of truth. So the entire state is in one store, which means there are not multiple stores, there's only one store. Then the state is read-only. I can't just change the state. I can only mutate the state by dispatching an action object to it. And doing so, like every change is a pure reducer function, which means I can really test them very well. But I can recommend there's this free ACAD series about getting started with Redux. And also the documentation is really awesome. They have really nice examples. If you're interested in that, I can really recommend this ACAD series, because I think it's way better than I can explain it right now. Let's continue with Webpack. Webpack is, I think, the most popular bundler which is used with React. There are also things like Browserify, which is nice as well, but personally, I would just recommend Webpack at the moment. Webpack works basically, you have your config.js, where you have an entry point of your app, or the output where the bundle will go. Then you have your loaders, where you just use a bubble loader, which is the transpiler for JSX, and that's actually it. Webpack will then do bundling for you, which means it can work with NPM dependencies, and in the end you have a bundle which has React, all these things. And you can also have maybe loaders for CSS and other things as well. This is, for example, how basic a Webpack config looks like. I don't really want to go into detail, but yeah. Another important thing is testing. You can actually use your favorite frameworks like Jasmine, Mocker, Tape, Ever, like everything for testing. And there's a nice thing by Airbnb. They build Enzyme, which is a really helpful tool for testing. You can just use this additionally. Facebook has Jest, which is really nice because by default they mock everything. You just unmock the things you want to test. It's, in my opinion, really clever way to write tests. And also there's a nice thing for unexpected JS, which is unexpected React, which is also something I can recommend because testing is actually important. If you want to develop React components and are into debugging, make sure that you use the React developer tools. If you work with Redux, also get the Redux dev tools. And when you build React components, there's a React hot loader, which works together with Webpack, but there are also things for Browserify, which I can really recommend because this is really amazing. It replaces your component, but it doesn't replace your state. And it's really amazing for development. Yeah, let's come to the conclusion before I go to the live coding part. Yeah, why React? My opinion, it's simple, it really abstracts a lot. JSX has the advantage that it's so in every environment, for example, on a server, like a node server, but in Rails, people using it. There's, for example, React Native, which are native apps built with React. And partly you can share even some components between your native component and your browser app. And it's basically JavaScript, so it's nothing else than JavaScript, and the API is not too hard. And it is really performant, like there were people reaching 60 frames per second, even in a not JavaScript JIT, for example, on iOS web view, which are way slower than normal views. And also it has a really nice community. There are always people helping you on Slack, Google Groups, IRC, Stack Overflow. Some downsides of React is that it's just the view layer, so you have to make decisions how you want to build your architecture. There are many, many ways you can combine it, but you have to find your way, and this is something which takes some time and maybe trying out new things. Yeah, that's so far. If you want to start Facebook, they provide you with a nice starter kit. There are nice boilerplates, for example, one from Max Stoiber from TJ. And there's also Chester.js, which seems, in my opinion, to be a nice opinionated boilerplate, how to use React. If you want to do further learning, I provide these 3 links, which are nice. The first one is where you learn React without JSX, Flux, Webpack. It's just React, how it's working. The second one has a weird name, but it's actually a good one, like the article title. And the third one is, in my opinion, has an amazing concept because it's a React introduction for people who know just enough jQuery to get by, which means if you come from this jQuery world, it's really amazing because they tell you how and where to use React in a way. That's so far from the presentation. I will just show.
Perfect. Pascal, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. All right. It looks like you went over everything really great. Nobody has any questions. It looks like everybody really understood it. The only question I had is, can you share the slides? But as to everyone watching this, you won't be able to watch this video back and forth on your own time, so you can just rewatch the videos. Therefore, you can just rewatch the slides. As always, to the people who are just watching this video later on, if you have any questions, you can just type them still in the comment section, and I can still just let Pascal know about it. With that, I just want to say, Pascal, I really appreciate it. Thank you very much for this intro to React. And to everyone else, as always, if you have any more questions, always just do let us know. And for future webinars, you can always find that out again at our Be My App, bemyapp.com. And with that, basically, that's about it. All right. Thanks a lot, folks. Pascal, once again, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. Cheers.